Hi, everyone. I go by Jono, but my name's Jonathan. I'm here from London right now. I'm doing a PhD at UCL. I worked at CERT at Carnegie Mellon for a while, like 5 or 6 years. The paper that this is roughly based on is work from also when I was at CERT, but this doesn't represent CERT in any particular way. None of this is CERT's official opinion, all of the disclaimers. Like, this is not in CERT's template. This is not their things. I don't know. CMU has a lot of lawyers. So thanks, Sunil, for that setup on models and stuff. I'm going to talk basically about how the people who study scientists talk about how they make models and what those models are, which is called philosophy of science or science and technology studies, right? I'm going to try to take the practical side of those things. There's a lot of the what is science stuff, which I don't like so much. I find that less useful. So I want to talk about how incident response in particular, right, CERT background and everything, benefits from scientific strategies for mechanism discovery, for finding stuff out. So there's a whole paper about this if you want, published earlier this month. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, incident response has these parts, right? Protect and prepare are ongoing. When you detect something going on, whether someone calls you and says your web server is attacking us, or you find it yourself, right? You triage what incidents you actually have time to handle, how important they are, right? You figure out what's impacted, you respond. So, as we've just heard, right, there's a lot of different parts to this. There's the users, there's the devices, all of these things. I'm going to focus just on the detection part of this, right? The retrospective, figuring out what happened. That is involved in both detect and respond and in triage, but I'm not going to figure out the strategy for best response right now. The other thing, which I think everyone here is aware of, is you have a scarce resource whenever you're doing any sort of incident response or detection, which is people's time, right? Like, no one has enough people doing defense. So partly what I want here is to help make some sort of decision procedure for what the best or most useful thing to study next is when you're doing some response. So by the way, I didn't make that diagram. That's from a paper. Disclaimers that such and so things. So there's a lot of these things that go around. We're like, security's not science, it's a art or whatever. So I would like to preface this with a couple of, I think, more nuanced responses to these two questions, right? So you don't repeat an incident, right? An incident only happens once. You can't run it again, right? So a lot of people say oh, well, it's physics, you repeat things, and that's what makes it science. Like, okay, great. So how many times did the dinosaurs go extinct? Wait, I think that happened once. We haven't repeated that, right? We haven't ran that whole 200 million year cycle over again and then observed if we were right. Okay, so is paleontology science? They interact with bench sciences, right? They interact with biology by studying chickens because they're apparently a lot like tyrannosaurs. But they also interact with modern DNA science, right? You can run DNA experiments and you can figure out how that works. You can do uranium dating, right? You put uranium on a lab bench, you can figure out how it decays, you can use that to date stuff in paleontology. So there's certainly repeatable parts of this, but when you're doing something that's historical, like forensics, that doesn't mean that it's not science just because you only happened once. The other thing, and this sort of bugs me, right, is aren't we looking for laws? What's the law of incident response? What's the law of how many people are going to attack me on Tuesdays? If you look at the philosophy of science literature over the last 25 years or so, it's a whole really labored defense of the fact that the physicists complained that the biologists shouldn't get any money because they didn't have laws. And it turns out that biology is science. Right? No one's going to say that you're not doing science when you're doing medicine. right? All of these biology things. There's not laws in biology in the same way that people talk about laws in astrophysics. If you want to talk to me more about Sandra Mitchell's work on all of this stuff, we can, but that's not, I think, directly relevant here, right? So putting that stuff about forensics not being science out of hand sort of behind us, I think that you guys giggled enough that that seems convincing. So what is incident response a response to, right? It's a response to intrusions. I'm going to talk about the kill chain because it's popular. Like, I don't know, if you guys have opinions about a different intrusion model, pick Bytelicks or pick the Howard and Longstaff one or pick whichever one you want. I think that this applies to all of them. I'm going to go through the kill chain because it is at hand, basically. In case anyone hasn't got this memorized, those are the 7 steps in the kill chain. I don't think anyone has any questions about this, right? Okay, so I'm going to apply philosophy of science to the kill chain. That's pretty much what the paper does. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the whole discipline of philosophy of science, it cares about 3 things. It cares about what is science, which I don't think is super practical, so I'm going to ignore. It cares about experiment design. And it cares about how to interpret the results of experiments once you've run them. So like one of my professors when I was doing this, I think in undergrad, philosophy of science, but studied neuroscience, that was what he worked with. Particularly, he was interested in the neuroscience development of one-day-old babies. Right? Sort of hard to design experiments because they don't talk very much. And you can't do the normal things that you would do to, say, rat babies and like cut them open because people get upset when you cut open human babies, it turns out. So how do you interpret the results of those experiments to tell something about cognitive developmental neuroscience, right? That's a philosophy of science sort of question. I would like to apply that sort of hard thing to forensics, to incident response, right? How do you design your observations in such a way that you get a reliable response that you can interpret to do the right thing to help your organization. So, turns out that right now, philosophy of science people don't talk about laws so much as they talk about mechanisms. Right? You had the word mechanism on your slides, I noticed very quickly when you clicked through everything, so I'm going to say that you agree with me. So this is a quote, like some disclaimer, Phyllis Iliari is one of my supervisors at UCL, so I'm a little bit biased, but I think that this is actually the best like consensus definition, not just because I like her. And so a mechanism, all of these words have, precise meanings, jargon, right? I think that the metaphor with a meter being undisputedly length is actually a little bit slippery. In most cases, when we use language, things don't have one single meaning. Like, what is a species in biology? People still fight about, even though Origin of Species is the title of the book that Darwin does for evolution, right? People, there's circular definitions in species if you don't pick, so sometimes we just have to go with what we mean by these words. So a phenomenon is the thing in the world. We're not going to talk about, the world not existing, right? Like, a phenomenon is the thing in the world. We can have that conversation later. Entities and activities are pretty much what they sound like. Organized and responsible here are maybe the 2 wiggle words. Right? Responsible for just means that they actually cause the phenomenon to happen, the entities and activities, and it's responsible because they're organized in such a way that it makes sense, right? It's sort of the intuitive definitions here, but if you dig into it a little bit too far, you raise some questions. Just don't ask too many of those. So, what do scientists do? They discover mechanisms. How? Well, the main strategy is that if you have a phenomenon at hand, right, you decompose it into some sort of manageable parts, and then you try to localize the activities onto the entities. There's some assumptions here. This doesn't actually work all the time, right? If you have a really tightly integrated system, you won't be able to do this. But if you try and you fail, then you know you have a tightly integrated system and you change what your hypothesis is. There's a whole book about how this applies. I'm being a bit cursory here, so Forgive me for being a little bit glib. There's other ways to generate hypotheses if you have a mechanism, or you can try to make something more specific. Right, so if you know that cells divide, right, that's sort of a mechanism, right? You have one cell and then you have two cells. You might want to know how, right, like how the chromosomes split, right? And then you want to know how the chromosomes split, so you can go down another level, and there's proteins that do that. You want to know how the proteins get activated, you can go down and do another one, right? I think that we can do this with incident response as well, right? You maybe know that something, you have something, right? You want to know what it's going to do. Maybe you know that something happens, but you don't know how it got there, right? So you can go forwards or backwards from what you have. I think the kill chain is an example of this, right? So if you have detected like command and control communication going out of your organization, you know that the other 5 or so steps happened. You might not know how, but then that's something for you to go figure out. So there's another more nuanced point here, right? What makes neuroscience one field rather than a bunch of disparate fields? What makes information security one field rather than malware reverse engineering and vulnerability discovery and HR and phishing management, right, and all of these things? I think it's that we have these different fields, but we're all contributing to some explanation of a pretty complex set of mechanisms, right? So when I said different levels, right, cells divide, chromosomes, right? The chromosomes get split, right? Those are levels because the entity in one is a mechanism in the one below it, right? So you get more specific. I think that we do this also, right? So you have security economics, which talks about marketplaces and why criminals have money for things and why they want money for things, right? How they get it and what marginal costs for things are. But then you also want to know like how the marketplaces function, which is microeconomics instead of macroeconomics, like all of these things. I think that we have a very similar setup for information security for what makes us one field that's reasonable for us to talk about the science of defense, right? Because there's actually a lot of different specialties that go on here, but we have to talk about how we can integrate, use the same words, right? Because if we aren't talking in some sort of coherent language with each other, we will talk past each other, we won't be able to integrate onto this explanation. And so I think that this helps understand what we're integrating, which is our mechanisms. So, this is the proposal. I want to leverage these existing discovery strategies from other sciences, from philosophy of science, to intrusion detection. I'm going to talk about intrusion analysis, I guess, really. And to do this, so there were the 7 steps in the kill chain. What are the entities? Those were all activities, right? So what we do in the paper is we come up with a diagram for the kill chain. I like to think of this as a mechanistic diagram just because the circles are entities and the arrows are activities, and I've organized them. But you could draw it however you sort of want. I had to figure out what the entities were. There's 3 sort of targets, right? There's the target person, the target computer, and then there's the rat that goes on their computer. So I think I've differentiated the target person and the target computer, right? So P is physical, like a meat world thing. E is engineering, so digital world thing. I think that that was missing something, right? So I split out the delivery one between basically social engineering and drive-by downloads and things like this. Right? If you phish someone, you don't actually have to install anything on their computer to steal their money, right? You can defraud someone without putting malicious software on their computer. So maybe it's useful to differentiate between social engineering and malware delivery, right? If you're maybe a defense contractor like Lockheed who's migged up the kill chain, right? Maybe you don't care about social engineering, defrauding pensioners out of their, like all of their savings, right? But I think that if you're a financial institution, you probably do, right? So maybe splitting these things out is more useful. And really, this just comes up because there was a gap, right? There's a gap in between when you do the social engineering one, which is the one that goes between the 2 big circles, right? You haven't infected the computer yet, so there's got to be another step where you get the person to click on a link or whatever it is. So what have we done? We tried to decompose it, right? As I sort of claimed that these are the heuristics. I found that this activity didn't have a target, so I guessed what it should be. It was already there, so it's pretty easy, right? But this is quite similar to sort of hypothesis generation in other sciences, biology, whatever we have you. Different stages in incident response, forensics, whatever, are going to use a mechanism differently, right? They're going to use this understanding, this explanation differently. Right? So if you're trying to prepare, you want to know what sorts of adversaries do something. Or if you're going to detect, you want to know what distinguishes it from benign traffic. Protect is maybe a little bit more interesting. Right? If you know what causes a disease, what causes someone to have the flu, do you know how to cure it? No. Right? Like, it certainly helps you with some candidates for what to disrupt if you know the mechanism by which the flu makes you ill. But it doesn't give you the cure right away. So it's a more complicated relationship than that. So I think that this sort of notion of the levels of mechanisms and the interconnected explanations really help us get a like appropriately nuanced understanding of what we're trying to develop. So for one final example, let me specify just that one arrow, right? So delivery is an activity in the kill chain, but we can talk about what the delivery mechanism is too. Like maybe it's a drive-by download, right? So we can do this. I have made a picture, so I guess you should believe me that I understand it. Like, the activities there happen in the order that they're numbered in, right? So there's a browser, right? You go to a website, the website redirects you to an ad network, it delivers a cookie, and then it uses the cookie to deliver some sort of exploit because it's targeted you, right? This isn't new, right? I'm not like saying that I figured out how drive-by downloads worked. I've just represented it as a mechanism. But the reason for this is that you can drill down, right? You can drill down again. If you're doing an actual incident, you want to know what that URL is. You don't want to know that a URL delivers the exploit. You want to know what it is so you can block it or correlate on it or whatever. Why is this useful to know, though? But this is useful because if you know that someone's been infected by a drive-by download, you know the elements of the adversary network that you are looking for. Right? It gives you hypotheses for what to go look for. You know that there's a website that they've went to. You know that it's redirected them to an ad network. You know that you don't see how that decision gets made. Or so you know you don't want to bother looking for that. But maybe you want to go and look and see what cookie got dropped in the browser because you know that those are going to exist. Whereas if someone is the victim of a different kind of attack that doesn't drop a cookie, you know not to go look for one if you can identify that that's what's happened. So these schemas, these like general mechanisms, give you hypotheses when you're doing the incident response for what to look for, which speeds everything up, right? So here's what I've sort of claimed that we've done with this kill chain paper about thinking about them as mechanisms, right? So we have some heuristics. It's all well and good. At this point, you're probably thinking, like, why do I care that he's come up with some heuristics that apparently biologists knew about for the last 20 years? Like, why is this interesting? Right? Like, why do we really care? I think that the point is not that good investigators don't do this. Right? Like, good investigators do these things already. I'm not telling them something new. The problem is that it takes 5 years to train someone to do that well, and you train them by an apprenticeship, which you don't really understand quite how it works. Right? Like, they follow you around, and they do some things on their own, and they start to sort of, walk before they can run or whatever. But like, when is it that they've learned enough things that they know how it works? Why is it that universities don't produce people who can do forensics? I mean, some of them maybe do. But again, maybe that's an accident. Like, why is the person who teaches that well at that university doing it well, whereas other ones don't? And I think it's because for other sciences, I think that we have a more established sense of what it is that needs to be taught because there's these heuristics that are sort of codified by the philosophy of science literature. But I don't think that we have that codified in the right way. So I think that's a lot of the point of this, is teaching more people faster instead of long apprenticeships that are sort of painful. And I alluded to paleontology, neuroscience, astrophysics also, right? You don't get to run the star exploding again. You end up watching a whole lot of telemetry, right, when you do astrophysics. You make a lot of observations about a lot of different stars. You can try to put some correlations together about what causes them to do certain things. I think that that's about it, so I'm going to get us some time back. Do you have any questions? Please.
Are you familiar with a systemogram?
No.
So what you've done is taken a systemogram and turned it into an activity state diagram. And I think that it's incredibly useful to take what has already been done with a systemogram, because lots of complex systems and social interaction systems are represented in systemograms. And now you turn it into an activity state, so you can describe what happens in between the interactions of systems. So that alone is a very powerful transition that was made in describing the mechanisms. So thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm glad that, I think that just means that I've done something that seems useful and I didn't know the words for it. Okay, awesome. How is a mechanistic model different from a threat model? Is that the question?
The mechanism that you, the systemogram / diagram that you drew, the activity model you drew,
Yeah.
seems like in our parlance, you could also call it a threat model.
So what I'm doing is representing the kill chain, which is, I don't know if it's a threat model, but it's an intrusion model. So I guess what elements are there of a threat model? Is it how you get hurt, or is it?
So let's take a threat model for the human body. Okay, there's all these different ways that you can get killed.
Yeah.
You die, and somebody's going to do an autopsy on you. It's going to essentially look at that. They have a threat model in their head, or can reference it in their book and say, this person died in this particular way because it matches this threat model, right? Yeah. Your computer got hacked in this particular way because it matches this activity diagram that you have that happens to correspond with drive-by malware.
Yeah.
Okay, so the threat model, or systemogram, or activity model, I think they're all.
I think a threat model is a subset of it.
Yeah, so I really think that it's not necessarily a threat model, but it's a pattern, and it's more of a reference architecture, right, in some way. So it's a pattern of, if you have these types of symptoms, then is this the causality that made it happen? Where I think a threat model is a very specific thing. This is more of an abstract item.
Although I would argue that the threat model feeds into this, because one of the things I think you touched on is, if you organize this as with the systemograms, threat models, other methodologies, the framework that we just talked about, the modeling we just heard about from some. If you take all of those things and you codify them, we all agree this is the language and the methodology we use. Now you can teach it to somebody.
Yeah.
And that's the difference, is that this is adding another way to describe this, to put a framework of single common language. And the other thing that this does, that the other thing's done too, is it defines actual what you do.
Yeah.
And so I think that the threat model will be a subset. Yes,
Oh,
exactly. Feed it.
Yeah. So if
Even help drive it.
Yeah. I think that one of the ways to bring this together, right? So mechanistic modeling is a way of generating and evaluating models and sort of telling you what elements it should have. And so a threat model would, in that case, be you would have a kind of mechanism, right? That is the threat mechanism.
So one of the things you mentioned, is you set out the university environment. Sometimes you got to have an apprenticeship program that takes you about 5 years to train people. Wouldn't some of that be both aptitude and then, forensics is a pretty broad field. We're talking endpoints, we're talking networks. You also got to think there, where's the real life solve? I would think in a uni environment, it's going to be kind of hard to train them on everything. That's where they focus on different segments.
So, we can get into sort of educational philosophy maybe a little bit differently, and that's going to be a different thing. But I think that, right, if university is sort of the old liberal university idea where you train someone how to think and not the content, right? I don't know that we're training forensics people to think about these things as mechanism discovery. I think that we're trying to train them up on individual facts, which then makes them sort of brittle. And so then whether or not they have the right thought process to adapt to the real environment is sort of a crapshoot, whereas maybe we could screen on the thought process. All right, so I got a few more minutes if you want some more questions. There was one in the back. Did you get your question answered?